Welcome to another Deck Tech brought to you by MTG Deck Techs and sponsored in part by Inked Gaming. Make sure to visit inkedgaming.com and use the promo code TEX10 to get a discount on all your supply needs. This week we're going to talk about Pro Tour 25's Turbo Fog list and the version run by Raphael Levy. While the Turbo Fog was run in a variety of forms, the most common shell was piloted by Raphael Levy at Pro Tour 25. His list went for a more balanced approach over the heavy card draw and control shell that some of the fellow competitors ran. He was less concerned about finding the key cards, instead he wanted to ensure that it was castable. To start, it's important to understand that the archetype of Turbo Fog didn't get played because the pros loved the fogs. The fogs had already been in standard. The card that drove the pros such as Levy to this deck was the very strong and hard to find Nexus of Fate. Nexus of Fate is unique as it's an extra spell turn that is stapled onto an instant, and has the added value of preventing yourself from being decked, because no matter how it ends up in the graveyard, it gets shuffled back into your deck. The deck runs two forms of mana acceleration. The commonly seen Gift of Paradise. This card has a few implications over other ramp in standard. First, it gains you 3 life versus aggressive opponents, and second, it stays in play. This is relevant if the opponent runs a card such as Commit to Memory, and shuffles your graveyard back into your deck with a Time Twister effect. By not shuffling these 4 ramp spells back into your deck, it decreases the number of cards you have to filter through to find your Nexus of Fates, Fogs, and Planeswalkers. The second ramp spell was a little bit more unique. They played Beneath the Sands. In previous builds, players have tested Grow from the Ashes, and more commonly Spring to Mind, as Spring is a stronger late game card to draw you 2 at instant speed. The ability to cycle Beneath the Sands allows you to make sure that if your draws aren't perfect, you can discard this card to find other pieces in a more early fashion, and it replaces itself for 2 mana as opposed to spending the 9 mana to get a land and then draw 2 cards with a Spring to Mind later in the game. As the meta evolves, it'll be interesting to see how this shifts and whether or not Beneath the Sands was the right decision. The namesake of the deck is the Fogs, and while Fog isn't legal in the format, we have 2 that can fill the void. First, we have Haze of Pollen, and this is the more important one because it can be cycled versus Control and other non-combat decks where this card would normally be dead. All it does is prevent combat damage, similar to the other version of the Fog where we run 4 Root Snares. Both are 2-mana instants that prevent combat damage, but they have some downside versus decks like Blue-White Control, and versus decks like Mono Blue Storm where Aether Flux Reservoir doesn't deal combat damage, so these cards don't do anything. This deck is going to be made to blank the aggressive decks Game 1 and have a sideboard plan for the interactive decks. The deck needs to be able to churn through its list and find the Fogs and Fates needed to turn the corner. To generate advantage, this list first employs the standard dig tech in the form of Anticipate, looking at the top 3 cards and always taking whichever one is needed to stabilize, or shifting into taking the corner turners as the game becomes locked up. Next, the Ixalan block brought a home run in the form of Search Vazcanta. It fits in the deck perfectly, as it enables the draws to be fixed by discarding cards off the top of your library or milling them as you don't need them, and later in the game flipping into a ramped land and allowing you to find your Fogs and Nexus of Fates as necessary. Lastly, we have a unique one in the form of Oath of Teferi. In this list it was a 1-of, and it only bounces your own threat and brings it back into play at the end step. So this will allow you to reset a land for interaction, or reset a Planeswalker that you previously minus so it can go back to a larger amount. But more importantly is the second ability of activating your loyalty of Planeswalkers twice. This is important because the Planeswalkers in this deck, which there are a few, run multiple ways to generate card advantage, through scrying, drawing, or putting cards into your hand based off your opponent's decision. So being able to do these effects twice allow you to be able to charge them faster for ultimates and generate card advantage that your spells don't necessarily give you. The Planeswalkers are the reason this deck can close out games. In previous forms of Turbo Fog, these decks will typically struggle to close out games within a reasonable clock. This version ran 3 different Planeswalkers. First, we have Nissa Steward of Elements, where you would have the ability to start scrying 2 to fix your draw steps, and later on in the game, you can -6, even if you just cast her for 8, and immediately -6 to attack for 10. When you chain together multiple turns, you can conceivably ultimate 2 Nissas in a row, and just deal 20 damage to your opponent before they get to untap their any permanents. Our next Planeswalker is Karn, who gets to generate card advantage by putting a card in our hand, and while it's our opponent's choice, if we would prefer to have the other card, such as a Nexus of Fate, we can always -1 later and return that to our hand. The other option we have is once we start chaining together extra turns, Karn's -2 to make colors constructs aren't very large because we don't run artifacts, so he makes 1/1s at first. But they intrinsically stack on top of each other, allowing us to slowly churn out larger and larger armies, especially if we're taking multiple turns in a row, to pressure our opponent or just flat out win the game. The hero of the deck would be Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. At 5 mana, he gets to draw us a card and untap lands for interaction. He has great interactions versus a flipped Search Razkanta, and he can also put cards on top of the library if they're a problem. The big effect is with extra turns, he will ultimate fairly quickly, allowing us to get an emblem and start just exiling permanents based off what's in play. Eventually we'll eat our opponent's permanents off the board, and they will either concede or will slowly develop until we're able to play 2 Nissas and kill our opponent, or a Karn and -2 multiple times to make enough army to kill our opponent. Generating the advantage through the +1s and the Scries off Nissa, we can hit Nexus of Fates pretty regularly because we will also have Search Razkanta and Anticipate rolling. The mana base is fairly simple and straightforward, and it prioritizes untapped lands over utility. It runs 8 cycle lands from the Amonkhet block, so that way it can discard the lands if they are excess, but also because they keep all the dual lands coming into play untapped. Its dual lands are 8 in the form of Glacial Fortress, Sunpetal Grove, and Hinterland Harbor, and a lot of basics that will follow it up, just to make sure that our lands are coming to play untapped from turn 2 and forward if necessary. The basics come in at 10, where we have mostly forests and islands, and a singleton plains because we aren't running white board wipes, so we don't need the white mana as heavily. We just need to be able to cast single white pips in our spells. The deck has a very strong game 1 versus aggro decks or decks that want to win through combat, so its sideboard is fairly built just to attack the combo decks and then a few other random things that might pop up, such as Mono Blue Storm. In the sideboard, we start with 4 Jace's Defeats. This allows us to counter anything that's more expensive traditionally, such as Disallows, Teferis, Torrential Gearhulks, and it's not restricted to spells, so we can stop creatures that are also a problem. On top of the Jace's Defeats, the deck also gets to run 4 Negates. Because all of our counter spells are 2, it typically gives us a trump in the counter wars against blue-white, who will be depending on Gearhulks, Syncopates, and Disallows to be able to counter our spells when we only spend 2 mana. Lastly, we want to make sure that we can kill our blue-white opponent before they can generate enough card advantage to find answers for our situations. To accomplish this, we run cards such as 4 Carnage Tyrant. This card is built just to attack control decks. It is a 6 mana 7/6 with can't be countered and has hexproof, so once it's in play, as long as you don't attack with multiple Carnage Tyrants and get blown out by a Settle the Wreckage, you typically will clock your opponent before they can stabilize, as 1 Gearhulk isn't enough to block it and kill it. Our last sideboard slot is just our catch-all. Traditionally in other formats it would be considered your Oblivion Ring, but in this situation we run the 4 mana Flash Cast Out. If it's a dead card we get to cycle it, but we really bring this in for the Mono Blue Storm decks, or God Pharaoh's Gifts, or anything else that might do something broken, just so we can stop them from doing anything that would be considered in the standard scope combo-ish, and we can play the fair game as we want. So what do you think about the deck? Is Fog going to be a player till rotation, or would you build it in a different way? As always, let us know what you think down below in the comments, and if there's a deck you want to see a deck tech on, or get a stream of, also comment below. Make sure to give us a like or follow on YouTube and Twitch to get the latest video content, or to let us know what you want to see streamed, written about, or deck teched. And on Twitter, Facebook, or down below in the comments, you can always request decks to get a deck tech or a stream if you would like to see those done.